have an Oasis?
Yes.
And it's our parking pass?
It's not your parking pass. No, we have them back there. Yes. All right. So again, thanks for coming on such a beautiful evening. I just thought there were going to be like half as many people because it's just too lovely outside. So thank you very much for coming in. Where we left off last week is the question of the issue that it has to matter and the various aspects of what it means for things to matter. And I was talking last time all about external things that matter. Government institutions, educational systems, friends, environment, cultural support, all these issues of the general milieu that can support a cultural fluorescence. All of which is important and significant, all of which I also think tends to be dramatically overemphasized. In the introduction to the lecture series on the first night, I talked about the fact that we tend culturally to look at institutions. We want institutions. We say, if you want great arts, you need the government to spend a bunch of money on art, or you need private donors to spend a bunch of money on art, or you need these big systems, big institutions, big structures, infrastructures that will make art happen. The historical evidence for this is very poor at best. Always good to remember that fascist Germany, Maoist China, Stalinist Russia spent big money in various ways on the arts, both burning and creating. And neither turned out to be very successful. I mean, the burning turned out more successful than the creating. But it both, the attempt to institutionalize art runs counter to many of the subjects which we've been discussing, right? Because it is an individual expression, and if anything institutions dislike, it is individual expressions, right? This is one thing they tend to be very, very down on. Not purposefully necessarily, but structurally, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Tonight, though, I want to emphasize the other half, the vastly more important part, which this is a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, from Thus Spake Zarathustra. It says, "We must be our own weight, weigher, and scale." I think this is fundamentally correct when it comes to the humane arts. In the beginning and the end, it has to matter to you, us, as an individual. And it has to matter in a way that is, we are the weight. We decide the importance. We're the weigher. Whatever it is, we're the one that puts it on the scale against the weight, whatever we want to use as the weight. And we're the scale. We're the thing that we use to measure it by. It's sort of a way of re-articulating Socrates' notion that man is the measure of all things. We are the measure, individually. Again, something we talked about at the beginning. As individuals, we must be the one that says that it matters, that it has weight, why it matters, and it matters on our scale. It doesn't matter to somebody else. It doesn't matter historically. It doesn't matter to the press or to the popular or to the elite or to anything else. It has to matter to us as an individual. And if it doesn't, this becomes a problem. And I don't believe in this purity. I'm very dubious about purity all the time, so I don't think it's an unmixed world. But a great example of this, an author was speaking in one of my classes 2 weeks ago, and she's had some moderately successful books, and she was talking about her relationships with her publisher. One of my students said, "Well, do you like what you publish?" And she paused. And she says, "Well, see, there's an editor that you work with. And the editor tells you what you can and cannot do. And so there's always a tension that I feel between what I would like to do and what I know my editor will allow me to do." Right? And I thought, well, this, right there it is. There's the tension. She knows that she is not writing what she wants to write. And the great question from the student, credit to them. And she finally ended up going, "So, I generally like my books the way they go, but, this is the world we live in." And I thought, there it is. Right? Even on her own scale, her. She knew she wasn't measuring up, which is fine. Don't be deluded, right? That's what I think is the most important thing, to know that, to not tell herself, oh, I'm writing just what I want and I love it. That would be the problem. This is an unbelievably, I think, challenging task. One reason it's helpful if we have a milieu that supports us is because I think if it supports us to do this, that's the best it can achieve. That is, any institution, any outside support is that which helps us to be our own weight, weigher, and scale. But it's extraordinarily difficult. So as an example of this and how the arts, I think, in some ways have gotten off track, I want to use, if you look at your picture, I wanted to talk about gardening, which may seem like special pleading, which it is because I love to garden, but this is a picture of a garden from sort of northeast of Isfahan, and this is one of the few existing or remaining traditional Persian paradise gardens. We no longer consider gardening an art form. This is gone. Gardening is not an art form generally considered. This died because it does not meet various criteria for what we count as the arts. This is important to think about. Notice a couple of things. One, a garden is never finished. Plants grow, they die, it changes in the seasons. So the notion that a product must be the outcome, this is impossible. Because it never stops. It's different every day. It's very different throughout the seasons, and over years it's going to transform itself almost completely. And so to the extent in which we believe that the process of creating art, indulging in the humanities, is something that has an outcome, a product, see, we're wrong. That's wrong. The emphasis there is completely incorrect. We'll talk about that. Well, let's talk about that now, I guess. Why not? So, because the emphasis is incorrect, because it needs to be placed on the process, on the creating. Think about the example I gave last time. All these little kids learning to play music, great. But they start with the concert. You are going to give a performance. You're going to give a performance in 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 18 weeks, whenever. Sometime in the near future, because parents don't want to pay for a bunch of lessons and not get to see their kid perform, because that's what they're paying for. They're paying for the product. And so if somebody says to you, okay, we're going to begin with exercises that over a course of 3 or 4 years will allow you to develop performing skills, people are like, no. This is not what we're doing. Now, it may be a great way to learn to play the piano. Historically, this is how you should learn to play the piano. But that doesn't matter. This is not what we're going to do. You work backwards from the product, the performance. So then you've got to find a piece that is moderately within the skill level of the student who's going to be performing this piece. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with how much the student loves the music. It doesn't have anything to do with their desire to perform or play. No, it's just this fits. Also, notice they can't play a 120-minute piece. Because no, look, you're going to get about 3 minutes or 4 minutes. So we're going to pick some nice little subset of a classical piece that's been simplified for you. That is what you're going to play. Whether you like it or not, probably irrelevant. And then the practice is going to be structured around that. Anybody who knows kids who have done this and taken lessons, this is 9 times out of 10, this is the structure of the course. Because you build backwards from the product. Talk to professional painters, artists of any kind. Painting is a good example. They say, what size should you paint? You should paint the size that fits over the sofa. You should paint the size that fits over the sofa because this is the size that people buy. You work backwards from the product to the creation, which is, again, precisely incorrect. Because it's the process of creation that theoretically you're supposed to be enjoying and performing. Second, not only is there no product per se that is stable and finished that can be sold or distributed or marketed, it's not actually in your control entirely. Right? It's changing because nature changes it. Imagine that someone has a painting and then it just sort of alters. Right? This would be, sort of the statue of David slowly morphed into the thinker, slowly morphed into something else over time. See, people would be put off by this. Because they're like, no, we want it to be a certain way. Perhaps the best example of this is all the Greek statuary we now know was painted, clothed, covered in jewelry, and had lots and lots of makeup on it. See, you cannot find it displayed this way. Because it's like, no, we don't want it that way. We want it the way we thought it was for all those years when we loved the abstract beauty of the white marble and blah, blah, blah. It turns out, no, that was all wrong. That skin was painted and they had a lot of makeup on, and clothes and jewelry and everything else. See, that's wrong. We don't want it to be that way. We don't want things to change. We want them to be the way we think they are. We want to have products that we can distribute and market and sell and that are finished and that we control. See, these are all very important aspects of it. So part of the reason gardening has gone out of existence as an art form is because it doesn't meet all of these criteria that are in fact brand new criteria. This didn't exist as a criteria 200 years ago. Art was not seen as the singular product that was finished, that came out of a great mind. I mean, think of the monks in the ancient monasteries like going, oh, work of Socrates, great, we'll just flip it open, scrape that off, because we got something else we want to write in here. Right? And you're just like, so they would just erase books, well, the equivalent of erasing them, because, we're done with that. We're going to write some new stuff in here. And we'll change that. So the notion that it's got to be fixed and absolute and revered, see, we love that idea. And there's something to it. But what about living things that change, that people occupy, inhabit, enjoy? See, well, that doesn't count. Also, gardens tend not to be edgy. They tend to be pleasant, which is I like this picture. I think the other reason another reason that we tend to lose the gardening as art, particularly in the Western civilization, is because we've forgotten the origin. That's why I like this picture. So if you take a look at this, notice when you're creating a garden in this environment, you're really creating something new. Right? This is not messing about. This is not like, well, we've got some trees and bushes and nice things, and we'll put some more nice things and take a few things out, and we'll look a garden. Right? No, this is bleak. Right? And this goes on for a long ways in every direction. And to stop in that and to say, as are called paradise gardens, paradiso gardens, we're going to make paradise on earth. That's our goal. What we want to do is transform a small part of the world and transform it into a living paradise for us to then inhabit. Think about the greatness of that idea here, right? When you're looking at that, it's amazing. First thing they had to do, they had to wall it in. So they would build vast walls. And they planted it, and it's their idea of paradise is different than our idea. But the green still holds. The beautiful geometry that they tend to be built in had to do with either Islamic or pre-existing Persian iconographic issues that we don't want to go into, but they were very meaningful divisions of heaven and such. But it was populated with scent and food. This is what you did with these gardens. Water, scent, and food. This is paradise. It consists of shaded spaces with beautifully scented flowers, all the food, fresh fruit you can eat, and water water, water. First and last. And look why. Right? That when you live in this environment. So you talk about a blank canvas being a challenge. Someone came up with this, planned it, built it, executed it, and said, look, we're going to construct on earth a paradise, and then we're going to inhabit it. I think in some ways the grandiosity of that vision here executed, they've executed many times here in a surviving instance. Shah Abbas, by the way, in Isfahan, has one of these that goes for about 5 miles.
So how big was this?
That is fairly big. I don't know what the scale is, but it's not 5 miles. Only sections of it still exist, but people still say that Isfahan is probably the most beautiful city in the world, and it only has remnants of what it once had. And they say those remnants are enough to make it certainly one of the most amazing places in the entire world. They tended not to build grand architecture. They tended to build relatively small architecture that was very human scale. This is another issue. So you have this idea of a temporal, real, earthly paradise. Wow, that is, as grandiose a striving for achievement as there has ever been in the arts. But we don't believe in it anymore. Because the function of art, as we understand it, is not to create paradises. Right? Entertain, enlighten, enliven, enrich, sell for money. But for most of the history of what we call the humane arts, this was precisely the purpose. The purpose of the arts was to help create in us and in our environment an earthly paradise. One Italian writer said the entire metaphysical history of Western civilization is to create people who are themselves cathedrals. That inside of us we carry some subset of the greatness of the artistic heritage to which we are the inheritors. And that gives us a depth, a richness, a long timeline that we carry everywhere we go. And so that when we enter a space like this, that goes with us as well. So the paradise garden, and they were very clear on this in the Persian tradition, is not just about building the beautiful space, which it was, but was then inhabiting it with the poets and the musicians who carried with them the great traditions of your culture. So this notion of a living, breathing, active, changing, seasonal, but vibrant paradise of the humane arts, of all the arts that you can think of and more, that was the model. And that was the model for a couple of thousand years, from basically Greek and Rome. This is from Persia. This predates them. Through the Renaissance. Why did the Medicis build all those crazy palaces? Why did they have, David, Michelangelo sculpting things like David, designing palaces, Laurentian library, gardens? I mean, they didn't have to. One is that they wanted to impress people. They're like, look, we're the Medicis. We are powerful. Look how great we are. The other side of it was, let's do nice things. Let's make the world beautiful. Let's make the world well-regulated. Let's make the world an earthly paradise. This is very clear. One of the things the Medicis did with their gardens, and there are several of them that follow this model, is there's all these civil wars going on. When the Medicis took over, they, sort of locked down. They're early totalitarians. But part of what they did is they created order and they reopened the countryside. One way to think about this is if an olive tree takes 7 years to come into production. So if you see an olive grove, it means that somebody felt secure enough about their future to plant something that was not going to return any investment to them for 7 years. See, for us, that's like, oh yeah, sure. No. In the 16th century, the 7 years, 7 days, 7 weeks was like a long time because they changed governments every other week. So when the Medici show up, lay out these beautiful garden spaces, and then plant a hillside with olives, And they say to everyone around them, hey, you can do this too. Plant wine grape, plant olive grapes. You're going to have the opportunity to make your money back. Because we're creating order, we're creating beauty, we're creating opportunity for humans to thrive. I mean, they're also vicious, backstabbing bastards. But that tended to be towards the people who didn't want the Medicis to be in charge, right? They weren't so much for oppressing the peasants, they were very much about oppressing the other nobles, right? There's a sort of a slight variation in the game there. But that ideal has waned. Notice how much now we emphasize art that is out there. It is out there. Paintings are out there. Sculpture is out there. It's not in here. It doesn't inhabit me. I am an experiencer of it from a distance. If you're a paradise garden, you're supposed to be inside. And if you start thinking about the creation, the performance of any of these traditions, that's what we've been talking about. This is why letter writing, conversation, all these are so important, is because they are activities that you participate in over time. I've mentioned this before, I talk to a lot of people who talk about being writers. I say it's easy to be a writer, you just write. What I think they mean is they want to be the kind of person who has published books. They don't want to write books. Now this is different. Right? Because writing books means that you sit down and push a pen around on a paper. Publishing books, I think, is a completely different undertaking, number one. But the writing them takes huge amounts of time. If you don't enjoy that, don't be a writer. Painting takes a huge amount of time. At some level, if there's not something that you get from that feeds you, then don't do it. But the arbitrary constraints that we've placed on it, again, the notion of product, the notion of having something that's fixed and finished, the notion that the outcome is what matters rather than the process, not only sort of pitches everything exactly the wrong way around, emphasis-wise, but I think it also damages the product. I like to think about, particularly writing, where what was her name? Gosh, she's a Canadian author. I think I mentioned her before. Her name I can never remember, but I think she takes about 7 years to a novel. And people say, you're a great writer, such a great novelist. I mean, how does that work for you? She says, I write. It takes me about 7 years. I enjoy writing, and then it takes me a long time to write another book. And then I write another one, and now she's like 72, and she's like, so she's written like 6 novels. She's like, that's a pretty good collection for a lifetime. I mean, you can't make any money doing that. Another way to think about this is, who wrote the Harry Potter series? Rowling, J.K. Rowling. Her publishers were pressing her to finish. Why? They knew it was going to sell. They knew it was going to be successful. Why didn't they say to her, take all the time you want, relax, enjoy the process? No, because they wanted that book now. Actually, they wanted the book yesterday. Right? And so she actually said this, that she felt under great pressure from her publishers to get that done as quickly as she possibly could. Because it was the getting it out that mattered. And I think if you read it, I think you'll notice this. It really sort of picks up speed. You're like, wow, it's really moving along. But this emphasis, notice, this is again back to the gardening issue. What if you can't finish? What if it never stops? What if it keeps evolving? Again, think of Mozart. He was famous for being able to churn out beautiful music. And Mozart was basically a jukebox. You put a coin in, he put music out. You put a coin in, he put music out. But there's several pieces of his music, the Jupiter Symphony, for instance, that he did work on and rewrite for years. If you listen to Mozart's collected works, which will take forever, listen to some parts of his collected works, becomes pretty clear after a time which ones he really spent time on. And which ones he was writing as fast as he could because he needed the money right now. It makes a difference. Again, think of form. You don't want to do things that are really small, because that's no good. You don't want to do things that are huge, because nobody has any place to put them. Or the institutional aspect of it. Again, this is not bad necessarily, but ask, artists, if you want to do some, say there's a commission from the state, and they want you for sculpture. I mean, look, the packet to try to get that commission is huge. And it's like a 3-stage jury process, and you have to fill out a lot of paperwork, and the entire time you have to be thinking, what kind of sculpture can I do that maybe will get me to win this award? And so you spend a lot of time thinking about what they want, and a lot of time filling out paperwork that has really almost nothing to do with you doing your sculpture. This doesn't make it bad, it just means that this is sort of a tax that people end up paying that distracts them from the fundamental issue, which is, wow, the creation and enjoyment and of the process itself. And so again, we must be our own weight, weigher, and scale. The final thing on this that the gardens help with is gardens don't lie. Nature doesn't care. If you plant, this is the perfect tree, you plant it there and it dies, you know what? That wasn't the perfect tree. You put another one of those there, if that dies there, you're like, that's the wrong place for that tree. That might be the tree you want, that might be the tree you love, that might be the tree you really think looks great. And nature doesn't care. Everybody who struggled to grow tomatoes here will understand, right? Exactly what I'm talking about. We want tomatoes, we love tomatoes. You can grow all the tomato greenery you want. The tomato itself is very elusive, right? Because nature doesn't lie. It doesn't matter if nature doesn't care if we want tomatoes or not. It's completely and totally indifferent to us. This is unbelievably valuable because the rigor necessary to enforce this on yourself. When you're gardening nature, you're meeting nature halfway. There's things you can't do, there's things that are difficult to do, and there's things that happen very easily. And so you take your idea of what you want to create, you put it in the context of what's possible and what nature will allow, and you hope for the best. And then that's a never-ending process. Now, imagine if you're painting, or if you're writing, you write something, now you have to decide during the process and at the conclusion, is it any good? Have I messed up? Have I gotten totally wrong-headed? Have I blown it completely? Or is it passable? Maybe it was just part of the learning process. And so I gained something from this, throw it away, move on to something else. It's a very difficult, unbelievably rigorous challenge because everybody knows we lie to ourselves. We're spectacular self-deceivers. It's one of the things I love about human beings. Our capacity for deluding ourselves is spectacular. And think about it when we've invested a lot of ourselves into a process, assuming that we've done this. When the writer was in the class, I thought one of the things that she did clearly emotionally is she transferred the responsibility for the quality of her work, the weigher, to her editor. And the scale he was going to use was his, and the weight was going to be book sales. But primarily, she just felt better. Well, I know what I want to do, I know what I think, but my editor says, huge transfer of responsibility. I don't have to decide now. It's not up to me to decide. I can transfer that to an outside force who then tells me how I'm doing. Now, this is sometimes very helpful. Outside criticism can be hugely useful. I think it's hard to function really well without it. But again, it can also be totally misleading. And she even said that it made her dislike a lot of the process of writing, which then made me think, well, why would you do it? Right? This is almost, if you don't like it, if you're struggling with this idea of the editor, why? Right? Because she's moved the scale outside. All of this is outside of her. Something else is going on. This is again where gardening gives us the advantage because there is the whole point of gardening is to garden. I mean, there's no, why do you do it? Because, you enjoy doing it. Maybe not everything. Weeding can get boring every once in a while, right? I mean, it can become a pain in the ass at certain times. But generally speaking, the only real reason to do it is because you enjoy doing it, and you enjoy sitting back and going, wow, that looks great. And then you do it some more. And then you go, wow, that looks great. And you do it some more. Anything that you think, wow, that really looks great, you know is going to look different tomorrow, in a week, a month, a year, 2 years. So it's weirdly permanent and also strangely evanescent. I mean, it sort of vanishes. Morning light, you go, wow, it looks great. Hour later, it's like, man, all the colors are washed out, sun's too bright. You know, it can be that fast of a transition. Think of other art forms that have no permanent component at all, right? If you think of dance, you know, ballet famously, opera really. You can record an opera, you can record a dance, it's not the same thing. Plays do not transfer to video at all. Film is a medium made to make films. Plays are not that sort of medium. They don't translate as plays to the medium. And so they're basically lost. So why do plays? Why would anybody ever do a play? It makes no sense. Because you just do it and it vanishes. Right? And people talk about Shakespeare's plays, right? They've lived for all these years. There's great writing, all this. I mean, they are, but they only live when they're performed. They live in the process of performing them. Novels, great novels, live in the process of reading them. They don't live in a book. They live inside of the reader. That's where they come to life. That's our cathedral. That's where they, having a book on a shelf and going, I've got the book on the shelf. Or there was some ad for a Kindle or a Nook or something I saw the other day that said, you can have 100,000 volumes with you all the time. And I'm like, no, you can't. You can have maybe 20 or 30 great books in your mind, in your history, in your heart, in your emotional makeup. If that many. I think that would be a huge number to be able to really resonate with and to recall with any great depth. It's not the books that matter. We love books. We fetishize books. But the books don't matter. It's the reading of it. It's the process of it. And then when you read the book, it comes to life in you. And then you can decide, is this a good book? Is this a bad book? My friend Jim Ball gave me a book a couple years ago called A Man in Full by Wolfe. Wolfe, I think his name, right? Yeah, Wolfe. Contemporary American author. It's about that long. And he said, you have to read this book. I said, great. So I read this book and I'm going, this book is terrible. Why does he want me to read this book? But I soldiered through the whole 600 or 700 pages and thought, this is clearly one of the worst books I've ever read by any sort of serious author. And when I went back to see Jim after I finished, I said, Jim, this is one of the worst books I've ever read. Why did you have me read it? He goes, I thought the same thing. I didn't make it work. He said, this is true. He said, I made it about 50 pages, and I thought, this seems terrible. I'll have Wes read it and let him tell me what he thinks. Right? This was both funny, but he really didn't need me to tell me what he thought. He knew what he thought. He was just interested if I thought something different. I was never going to convince him that it was a good book. He just wondered if he was maybe missing something or something like that. And then I would say, if you read through to page 400, this whole wonderful thing happens. You'd go, okay, there you go. At least, but no, see, you have to read it yourself and say, yes, no, indifferent, I don't know, I'll read this again in a couple of years. There's no other way. Anybody see the New York Times Books Review? I always think this is the New York Times Book Review is for people who aren't going to read those books. Right? This is the whole purpose of it, is they give you like the 5-page summary and they discuss all the issues, and people really feel like they've read the book because they read this very nice summary of it. And think how much more efficient, how quick that is. But it is not the same. I mean, we have to say that, but it really is not the same as spending the time in the mind with the thoughts, with the feelings of someone who's writing all those words. And at times it might be terrible and boring and off track, but that might be part of the person. You go, well, this is what they're doing well, this is what they're doing poorly. But again, you have to judge.
You told us to read All Passions Spent at the beginning of this lecture series.
Yes.
I soldiered through.
Ah, sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah. You thought it was a terrible book.
I didn't think it was a terrible book. I just thought it was depressing.
Oh, it was
So
slightly
why
depressing.
would I delight in it?
Yeah, that's right. So I thought it was a great book. But, I mean, not depressing for some reason. I just like that old lady.
I liked the old lady.
Yeah.
But she didn't start out an old lady.
No.
She soldiered through.
She soldiered through. Yeah. So, but how else do you know whether you're going to like it, right? This is the problem with being the weigher in the scale. You don't know until you finish to, like, why did he recommend this stupid book? Right? I didn't enjoy that at all. But you don't know, but this is back to the whole question of the humane arts, which we talked again from the beginning, the question of leisure. You have the time to do what you want. That's what leisure is for. You give yourself the license to do what you want. And when you give yourself the license to do what you want, you have to say, well, what do I want to do? Maybe I want to sit down and try to read this book. When do you decide to abandon a book? Is it page 50? Is it page 100? Is it page 150? It's a short book though, right? It's a quick read. You know, so when do you decide to bail? Because you just decided you just don't want to read it anymore. Or maybe you think, no, I'm going to soldier through this. For whatever reason. Right? It's up to you. But notice how limited a capacity we have to do that. How many works of art can you look at in a day, say if you go to a museum, go to the art museum, and actually experience? 3? 4? 5? I think much past 5, it just gets all a blur. Right? You're not really seeing it. You're not really responding to it. You know what I'm saying? It's just, I mean, how much can you take in? How much can you really interact with on an emotional, serious level? So that it lives in your cathedral, so that you can take it out of that museum and hang it in your head. Think how many paintings, sculptures, pieces of music, pieces of books do you have hanging in your cathedral, in you, that you carry around with you? Again, a couple of 100 maybe? That's the richness. Any museum in the world has thousands. We don't need thousands. I mean, it's nice that they're there. I'm glad that they're there. It's a good thing. But for us individually, how much can we take in process? This people always talk about, when they talk about the internet, it's like, oh, this is so great. Look at all this, look at everything that's on the internet. Well, it's true, and it is great. There is a lot of stuff on the internet. But notice it's all out there to go this way. This is only half of the process. And again, in some ways, the least important part of the process. Think of gardening again. If you have a garden, if you have ground, and you leave it, and you don't live here, something will grow. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, something will grow. If you live there, nothing will grow. Sand will grow. You can do that. You can just say, okay, whatever happens, I'll just let that go and call it good. That's fine. But there's nothing from inside of you coming out. You can visit 100 gardens, 100 paradise gardens, and take some of that in and go, okay, that's great. That's good, that's important, that can be enriching, but again, that's everything from out there coming in. At some point, part of this is to take what you've brought in and put it back out. To transform it into something that is in fact yours. Or at least partially yours, not entirely yours. This notion of reproducing. Think back again, letter writing. If you read the letters that were written, 1600s, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, what they tended to write about amongst gossip. Everybody loves to write gossip. Always fun to read, actually, the gossip. I don't know why 300 years later the gossip is still fun to read. But I saw a painting, I read a book, I had a conversation with this person, and here's what's coming out of me from that experience. The sharing of it. To say, I've taken in, I've gathered the honey, or I've gathered the pollen, I've chewed it up, spit it out like bees do, and now it's honey. And it's honey not for me, it's honey for others. Right? That each step of those processes is necessary. I have the ground. I'm in my garden, right? It's out there. There's nature. I can't provide everything. I'm collecting other plants. I'm doing other things. I'm participating with nature. But part of it, the organizing, the creating of it, is from me. Not all of it, but part of it. And it's just that continual cycle. Once you start emphasizing just the product, it breaks it down. And it begins to damage the cycle. Notice what people will say, well, is it a good book? They say, well, it's a New York Times bestseller. Man in Full, for instance. Right? Okay. That is an external weight, not an internal weight. There's no way you are not the New York Times, you are not the bestseller calculator. So this measure has nothing to do with you. If it says, Pulitzer Prize finalist. I just read a book that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, stamped on the cover. And I thought, that doesn't mean anything, right? Because, it means that some people at the Pulitzer Company thought that maybe this was a good book. I don't know why they thought this, but they did. After I read the book. But there it is. And so that we go, oh, well, that might be a good book. Anybody know Knut Hamsun, the author? So he was a Nobel laureate. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Everybody wanted to write like him. And if you read some of his books, you realize why people wanted to write like him. Brilliant author, beautifully written stuff, great plots, a little depressing. You might not want to read him, a little depressing. Because he was not an upbeat, happy, optimistic guy. But he sort of, at the very end of his life, he went a little fascist, right? He thought, well, maybe the Hitler people had it going on. And so all of a sudden his books became bad. And they just vanished. In 1935, if you ask people, what are some of the most important living authors in the world, most literate people reading world literature would have said Knut Hamsun, like one. You want important living authors? Knut Hamsun, he's your man. He would certainly be in your top 4 or 5. By 1946, he didn't exist, right? No one had ever heard of the guy. All his books were gone. Because of these external associations that had very little to do with what people who actually read his works thought, how they responded to him, what was in those works. And so, author, vanish. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's just like a hard winter freeze coming along and killing a tree you love. History is as indifferent to everything as nature is. Beautiful cathedrals burn down. They get bombed. Accidents happen. They get consumed in the desert dust. Happenstance. It's the living of them that matters. The capacity for us ourselves to decide individually that keeps the whole process rolling. And so I think this is, again, where we started with the humane arts and what we talked about conversation and letter writing and leisure, strolling. They seem insignificant. They seem sort of moderately unimportant, but it's just the other way around. They are the most important part of the entire process. They aren't the product. They don't guarantee the product. It just so happens that in any place where you get the product that people tend to love, you have these elements. And you tend to have them a lot. Because it is the process that you must be engaged in. And if you're going to be the weight, weigher, and scale, again, this burden requires introspection. It requires conversation. Again, the great story I keep telling about Dostoevsky burning that huge manuscript. Why would he do that? because by his own scale, he had decided what he was doing was incorrect. Now, he could be wrong. If we had that manuscript, we might say, well, that was a lot better than I think it's Crime and Punishment, actually, that he came out with. It seems unlikely, but it's kind of good, Crime and Punishment. But you never know. Maybe it was much tighter, had more action chase scenes. This idea that just saying, no, I'm burning it, that's him. That's him saying, no, I've thought about it, I've reflected on it, I'm not doing it. Crucially, we all know this because he wrote a bunch of letters about it. Here's what I've been reflecting on. Here's why I have my doubts. Here's where I think I'm not measuring up. I'm afraid I'll be too weak to do this, and I'll cave into my editor and send it to him, just because I'm desperate for money to eat. And so that's why he burned it, right? And he said, no, I'm starting over. I'm going to begin again, because I don't want to succumb to that weakness. I mean, again, it's a very high bar. Conversely, you can look at someone like Picasso, who, once he got rolling, basically he was printing money. But it didn't seem to affect him very much because all he did was paint anyway. Essentially, Picasso in some ways is sort of, he's just a guy who painted all the time. What did you do? Got up in the morning, painted. Go to sleep at night, he's painting. People who were building these gardens, they call it gardeners. If anybody knows Russell Page, one of the most famous garden designers of the early part of the 20th century, was famous for this. Briefly, but basically he never had his own garden, really never had his own house. He lived in the houses of his clients, who tended to have very nice houses. And they said, what do you do? He says, I'm a gardener. And they said, well, what do you do? I garden. He says, every day I get up, I plant, I arrange, I lay out, and then when he runs out of one job, he just finds another client and moves to their house. He literally didn't have a house for years and years, decades, not years, decades. No house of his own. He had an apartment for a while that he never went to. And he just lived with other people because he got up in the morning, gardened until he went to sleep at night. Got up the next morning, gardened until he went to sleep at night, right? Just repeat the cycle. Why? Because he liked it. Capability Brown. People know he's the most influential landscape designer. Much of the English countryside was laid out by Capability Brown. He's now moderately controversial because he didn't like a lot of the creations that came before him and he dug them out, right? So sort of a whole big swath of garden history was dug out by one guy, Capability Brown. But he planted forests, a lot of big sweeping landscapes with woods, and now we look at him and we go, that is amazing, these gorgeous... Well, when he planted oak trees, they were only about this big. And we have his letters and his plans, and he's like, in 250 years, you're going to be able to stand here, literally, and look across this incredible grove. And now it's 250 years later, and it turns out he's absolutely right. It looks spectacular. I mean, it looks amazing. But when you have a 55-year-old person standing someplace saying, in 250 years, this grove is going to really set off the curve in that landscape, and it's going to catch the morning sun quite perfectly, it means they're not involved in the product. They're never going to see the product. His children would not live long enough to see the outcome of the work that he was doing then. It's an astonishing achievement in some ways, to just completely let go of the outcome. He's not letting go of the outcome, he's just embracing the process. The process is a century or 2 centuries. That's what it takes for oak trees to reach maturity. We like mature oak forests. If you've ever been in them, they're stunning, they're moving. But we don't tend to plant a lot of them. Right? Because it's like if anybody's been to the redwoods in the Pacific coast, right? We go, wow, this is beautiful, this 2,000-year-old tree, it's amazing. We don't tend to plant them. We don't go, oh, I'm going to plant a redwood forest so that in 2,000 years, this is going to look spectacular. People tend to plant 1 or 2 of them, usually right next to their house, which is always attractive. Because you're like, well, in a couple of years, that ain't going to work. That shit ain't not going to work. This always kills me. But, because we have, again, this time scale that we want to do something that we can finish. If you watch gardening shows, they tend to do this. Oh, we're going to redo the backyard this weekend. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? right? Capability ground, we're going to redo this backyard this millennium. Come back next millennium and see how it comes out, right? I mean, just stay tuned for a few hundred years, right? I mean, that again, but notice how it seems funny, but really we operate under these, again, artificially tight time scales. If you're gardening, at some point you just have to let go of that because you want to plant things that are going to reach maturity. It's bad to plant big trees; they die. You want to plant small trees; they grow better, they grow faster. Everything. In 5 years, a small tree will be bigger and healthier than a big tree. It's just a rule of thumb. People hate to plant small trees because they don't want to wait 5 years. But this is the advice that you get. So in every way, we've sort of translated this notion by emphasizing product rather than process. By emphasizing control and outcome and deliverables, right? When you fill out a grant, that they don't want you to say, well, in 200 years you might have something that looks pretty fine if you purchase my artwork. Right? See, that's no. We need something that's going to be delivered on a very concise time scale. And if you're late, see, that's really bad. And again, this is not evil or some plot. It's simply the nature of allowing external factors to drive us, which is in part necessary. Again, I don't believe in purity. I mean, we live in a world where there are necessities. We like to eat. We like to have houses. We need to do things. But you need to return again and again to this idea that we must be our own weight, weigher, and scale. If it's not us who decides it's important, it can never be important. One more example on this, because I see my friend Wendell back there, because I was pondering this because of sailing. Sailing has never been considered an art form. The Greeks did consider it techne, which is technical things, like sculpture. They did not consider sculpture art. They considered it a technical achievement. But sailing is another one of these things where, see, the wind is going to do what the wind wants to do. And if you're on a sailboat, you can think, well, the tide's going this way, and the channel is that way, and I want to be there, and the wind is going this way. And you make all your plans and arrangements, but you can be wrong. And if you're wrong, it lets you know, because you don't end up being where you want to be, right? And in some ways, that's both the challenge of sailing, like the challenge of gardening, but it's also quite helpful, because then you know you've messed up. One reason people tend to dislike sailing, and why you see so many sailboats being motored around, right? You always see people with sailboats, they always have the sails tied up and the motor running, which makes me think, well, buy a motorboat, right? This is why are you confused? Because sailboats are not good motorboats, and vice versa. Well, because if you really want to get where you want to go, well, you cut out all that weather and water and being outside, all that nonsense. You cut out the process, and you get to the business, which is transportation. Right? I want to be there, and I want to be there by 6 o'clock. If I leave now, I can make it. If I leave a little later, I'll just run the motor faster. I don't have to worry about tides and winds and so on. Because it's the process that we've come to almost totally devalue. Again, think back to the piano lessons. If you read, there's some great old books on the way piano used to be taught, and they spent a long time on proper finger form and position, because you're not supposed to press with your fingers. You're supposed to let your fingers fall. Right? You let your fingers fall on the keys, which is it's a tricky thing to get the feel of, but when you sort of get the feel of it, it makes sense. And you need to use just that part of your finger to get good tone. And they talk about this endlessly in the old books. They say, look, tone, tone, tone. Because when you play a piano, what are you producing? You're producing tone. This is what we like to hear. And if you can control the tone and produce pleasing, mellifluous tone, people tend to like your playing. As far as I can tell, this has just vanished. I'm sure there are great classical teachers out here who are continuing this tradition. But by and large, there was a PBS series, and now it's a big book and everything. You can find it online. This guy's like, Play the piano now. Amaze your friends in just a week of practicing these chords. Right? Because the reason to play the piano is to amaze your friends. This assumes, of course, your friends have no musical taste. Right? Because if you've been practicing for a week or 2 weeks and you can amaze them, they're either drunk, stoned, or stupid. And I suggest you get new friends. Right? Your friends should tell you, wow, you don't know what you're doing. What are you? Why? Leave that poor piano alone. What did it ever do to you? But this is a whole theory built on this. Right? Oh, you just play these chords. And he literally is doing this to the piano. And you're like, ow, 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 ow. Right? This is, look, chord, just hit it. You just hit that damn thing. You can do that with a harpsichord because it's a plectrum instrument. 100 years of the evolution of the piano, so it was a sensitive to the touch of the human being. Bang, 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 bang. Which is okay if you're a little kid sitting at the piano. If you're telling people how to play the piano, what you've tried to do is eliminate the process of learning to play. Because what we want is to amaze our friends. Right? And if that's the outcome you desire, then the faster I can get to the place where I can bang out some songs and go, hey, the better off I am. If you tell me, play really slowly, press, you should see these exercises they have people doing. Like just play that note, like at every volume level. Fortissimo, mezzo, fortissimo, right up and down the volume scale for a long time. I think it would be mind-numbingly boring. But this is the method that has been proven for generations of spectacular classical pianists and piano players. And many jazz piano players, by the way, follow on classical technique very closely, particularly early on. And we like to think of all these black guys out in the middle of no place banging on pianos. In some cases that's true. A lot of those guys were extraordinarily skilled technicians at the piano. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they studied and practiced very hard, and they stole everything they could from classical people because they weren't allowed in the classical academies. And so they're like, I want to learn to play like that. I want to play that music. I don't want to play that oeuvre. But I want to know those techniques. And so these guys could play. They're focusing on that, right? So this is the idea. If you look at something like a gardening or a sailing, it's the process that makes it happen. There is essentially no fixed outcome that you can ever achieve. For us, that's wrong. There is no deadline or date where it terminates. You don't say by Wednesday at 4 my garden will be done. What would that mean? I don't even know what that would mean. I'm done. You can be done gardening, I guess, in which case you say I'm done. Or the notion that people say, I would love to have a big garden. And what they mean is I'd love to have a staff of people out there taking care of my big garden. Because you see their small garden, it looks like hell, and you're thinking, that's right, multiply that by 100 times, I bet it would look better. No, it would look like hell multiplied 100 times. But notice that idea then is that the staff do the grunt work, and then you enjoy it. It's like people who hire people to ghostwrite their books. I'm like, what? Why would you hire someone to ghostwrite your... Isn't the writing of the book part? No, they don't think it's part of it. What they think it is part is the tedious part that you farm out. Because we don't really want to do that. It's like, I want to be able to practice the piano and learn really, really, really fast. Because the process of learning to play the piano, that's no good. No. Isn't that the joy, the slow accretion of the capacity to make a piano, which is, let's face it, it's just a big box of strings. Express you. Become evocative of your feelings and your ideas. To be able to, together with the machine, this instrument, evoke a part of your nature. To bring what's in your cathedral out. This attempt that we continually seem to be under pressure for in our society to shortcut that is precisely why, one, again, things like gardening are not considered art forms because they don't meet all these external criteria. Two, because we try to get rid of this. We are not our own judges. And if you ask people, they tend to know. if you really, really dig in there, do you really think you're playing well? Well, no, but look, they seem to like it. Oh, that's good? And you can see artists who have done this. Musicians like Miles Davis, famous for this. Good Lord, he's doing something different every week. And they're like, why? People like what you were doing. And he's like, yeah, well, so I'm pressing on. He was sort of interested. He liked that people liked his music because he made a lot of money from it. And that gave him a certain amount of freedom. But mostly he was interested in doing what Miles Davis wanted to do. Even to the point perhaps of distraction. Some people argue that he really just forced himself to change for change's sake, which may not be that helpful either. But he was certainly the main arbiter of this. Nobody worked like Miles. Nobody approached music the way he did. Everyone thought he was a little crazy, which he maybe was. Same thing with sort of a more contemporary figure like, say, Bob Dylan, who just seems to sort of recreate himself continuously, make new, different music that people go, oh, well, we liked what you were doing. It's like, well, now I'm doing this. It's like, oh, we don't like that. Too bad for you, because I think it's interesting. You know? So that process of making it alive is the process. This is the most important thing about what we've been talking about, is this issue of the humane arts live in the process of lived lives. You can't build a museum to hold it. It can't be in a library. It can't be on recordings. It has to be physically incarnated in the cathedral, in theory, that we can or have become. And that means, fundamentally, being our own judge of what's both inside of us and outside of us, and engaging in processes that never stop. They don't end. They don't culminate. If you finish a canvas, there's another canvas. If you finish a book, there's another book. If you finish some music, there's more music. If you play an instrument, you just try and get better and better and better. There's no end. At some point, it's not even better. It's just more different, varied exploration, infinite. These things are whole worlds to explore and bring something out and back that you return. So, yeah, that would be the idea. And again, so keep this in mind, because I just love this image finally. One, because it reminds us, because it almost looks like a picture in a frame, right? That it was an art form. And two, that I think that this is basically an allegory of our world. That this is our world, and then this is what we can create in that world, right? That we can incarnate this sort of paradise to a certain extent, regardless of how extreme, immense, overwhelming the desert may at times seem. So yeah, there you go. Thank you very much. So,